On this week's 51%, happy Halloween. We're getting in the spooky spirit and swapping ghost stories with Leanna Renee Hieber and Andrea Janes, authors of A Haunted History of Invisible Women. Why are women so prominent in America's ghost lore, as they say, and what does it say about us?
She no longer needs to be your dutiful daughter, sacrificing wife. She's suddenly free to be completely unleashed.
I'm Jesse King. It's all up next on 51%.
I was standing around like one of those girls I had seen in a movie. The whole world was a movie back then. I had my sunglasses on, I wanted to be seen without seeing shy Lolita. I wasn't really in it, I didn't really get it.
You are listening to 51%, a WAMC production dedicated to women's issues and experiences. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Jesse King. We're at the end of the spooky season here. Depending on when you're joining us, Halloween is either right behind you or just around the corner. The holidays present an opportunity for me to have a little bit more fun with the topics on this show, and Halloween is one of my favorites, so I'm not going to pass it up. Our guests today are the authors of A Haunted History of Invisible Women, True Stories of America's Ghosts. When you talk scary stories with Leanna Renee Hieber and Andrea Janes, you're really talking shop. Both are longtime ghost aficionados and have built careers in the paranormal industry. Leanna Renee Hieber is the award-winning author of several gothic and supernatural novels, including the fantasy romance saga Strangely Beautiful and her Gaslamp suspense series The Spectral City. She met Andrea Janes while working as a tour guide at Jane's ghost tour company Burrows of the Dead in New York City. In their new book, the pair strive to tell the stories of America's most famous female ghosts and recognize what we can learn from them, even as skeptics centuries later. Just a heads up that, as you might imagine, most of these stories involve gruesome or troubling subjects. Janes and Hieber make it their mission, especially in this era of true crime podcasts and serial killer dramas, to treat these tales with respect. But if you're someone who could be triggered by discussions around murder, abuse, or suicide, this is probably not the interview or episode for you. For Janes, the journey to this book started when she realized that the majority of her ghost tour clientele were women. She argues in her introduction that women have, quote, always lived cheek by jowl with death, leading spiritualist movements and writing ghost stories almost as much as they star in them. She says the feminist lens writes itself.
For example, just this idea of invisibility, this idea of a woman's kind of marginalized experience. Don't even get me started on invisible labor, the kind of devaluation and denigration of women's contributions. And as I started to kind of delve more deeply into these connections between female lives, women's history, their reflections in ghost lore, I started to notice not only these thematic and metaphorical connections between the ghosts themselves and the lived experience of a woman, but there was this kind of also delicious subversiveness to it, where a female ghost could kind of flip that script a little bit. So disempowered and silenced in life, perhaps, but suddenly as a specter, as a spirit, she had this kind of colossal power, and it is a power that can never be taken away, because the worst thing that can already happen to you, death, has already happened. So now there's literally nothing to lose. And I found this really great quote by a writer called Andy Zeisler. She was talking about how a female ghost is a terrifying possibility because a female ghost is a woman who's stripped of all the structures and societal placements that hold her down during life. So she no longer needs to be your dutiful daughter, your devoted mother, your sacrificing wife. She's suddenly free to be completely unleashed. You can't silence a ghost. You can try. You can try to exorcise a ghost. You can try to make a ghost be peaceful and quiet. But a ghost who doesn't want to be silenced will not be silenced. And a haunting is, by its definition, an ever-present reminder of something in the past that you failed to fix. So it's this wonderful kind of vengeance. At the same time, though, just like with a woman's experience in life, there's a tremendous variety of ghostly experiences, from angry, vengeful, wailing, sorrowing, to loving, nurturing, friendly, helpful, poignant, there's this incredible range, funny. So it was just this really satisfying project. And it was really fun to kind of organize the book along the lines of tropes, which may be a question you're going to get to. So I'm not going to jump on that. But that was one really fun way of organizing the project.
I guess before we dive into the stories themselves, I don't know if this is true per se or if it's just the stories that I know, but why are so many ghost stories set in like the 18th or 19th century? I feel like the story you usually hear is along the lines of Lizzie Borden or these vengeful, tragic women in white types.
You'll find a lot of named men in some ghost lore. I mean, but a lot of times I think women become these collective stand-ins. And especially in the 19th century, the more you repress a society, the more it has ways of subverting that suppression. And so I really do think a lot of the ratcheting down of gender roles that was happening in the 19th century kind of gave rise to these other either tropes and stereotypes that reaffirm that ratcheted down, absolutely austere gender roles, or are pushing past it. Either way, it's commentary, and we are still sorting out as a society a lot of our thoughts about the 19th century. You know, we're still kind of trying to extricate ourselves from some of that repressive nature. And we're still fighting for our rights in ways that I was hoping I wouldn't have to keep fighting for in this particular day and age as I'm writing about the 19th century, you know, in my work. But in some ways, these women become stand-ins and sirens and any and all metaphors, because so much of women's existence has been sort of, you know, dramatized one way or another, for better or for worse. So we really try to kind of pick that apart as best as we can in A Haunted History of Invisible Women.
You know, the prevalence of 19th century ghosts, that is a question I think we get fairly often. Mm-hmm. And it's a good question. People often wonder why every ghost is from, you know, 100 years ago, 150 years ago, and where are the modern ghosts? And I think it has to do with a couple of things. One is the prevalence of ghost belief in the 19th century, the fact that the bulk of American history takes place in that century, the 20th century as well. But then by the time you get to the modern era, by the time you get to the First World War, the belief in ghosts has faded out and become ridiculous, or at least ridiculed. And it's been replaced by other, I think, pressing concerns. And then also, of course, the interest in death, the Victorian era interest in death, you know, you can't overstate that. So you have as well a great deal of trauma in the mid-century in the United States. Obviously, with the Civil War, you have the prevalence of death. It's a focal point. It's a collective societal obsession and fascination. And in terms of pop culture, ghost stories are a huge form of entertainment, and that's later going to be replaced by other media. The golden age of the ghost story ends by about 1920. And then again, talking about these connections between the feminine and the spectral, women were terrific engines of just churning out ghost stories in that era. So, and that's because I think the short story form is ideally suited to a woman's lifestyle. She rarely has the luxury of, you know, a full-time, you know, 8-hour day in a private office to write in, and she's often squeezing in her writing in little stolen moments of time. So the short story form agreed very much. And of course, women were allowed, in quotes, to write genre because it was slightly disreputable. So again, just these myriad connections. But the typical 19th century ghost, therefore, is going to reflect very antiquated attitudes. And it's kind of funny because a lot of people will take issue with some of the statements that we made in the book and say, well, that's not true. And it may not be true anymore, but it would have been true at the time these ghost stories were being written and talked about. And as Leanna pointed out, sadly, some stuff either has not changed or has changed and then changed back. I think it's not a given to say that we no longer find these stories applicable or relevant at all.
Just to add on to that too, it's like the prevalence of women dying in childbirth was, you know, for all the industry and all of the technological revolutions and evolutions of the 19th century, health was lagging far behind, and women were dying in childbirth a lot. And it was very dangerous, and the infant mortality rate was very, very high. So anytime that you have instances of mass death, whether it's the Civil War or whether like looking at spiritualism and interest in ghost stories after the First World War in Britain, that took back off again. But like for America, because we didn't have in this country, we didn't have the loss of life that Europe had in the First World War. our interest in spiritualism was really a much more of a 19th century thing. When you look at 20th century spiritualism in Europe, that got this huge boost because of, again, this mass death that people were trying to get their heads around. And if you're trying to get your heads around loss on a huge scale, then the concept of talking to a spirit and connecting with the spirit world is a huge balm and a huge salve. So it's not necessarily even that these things are there to always like spook or scare us. In a lot of ways, the connection, the longing for a ghost story is actually because we long to be reassured of life after death.
Let's take a look at some of the stories in your book then. Do you have any favorites that you'd like to share with us?
The list of favorites is kind of as long as the book itself, isn't it? Do we choose each our top 3 or 5?
Yes, I have 3 for different reasons. I have a top 3 for different reasons. I always say like Sarah Winchester because there's so much to unpack, and she's my longest chapter in the book. And I've always been fascinated by her. So for that, on a pure level of just engagement with the person and the place, the Winchester Mystery House. Ma Green, Mary Becker Green, because she's a hometown Cincinnati hero, and she still haunts the ship that she captained, the Delta Queen, and she was the first woman to obtain a steamboat pilot's license in 1892. So she's just a delightful spirit who was just such a breath of fresh air to write about. And then I would have to say my most harrowing chapter, mainly because I think it's some of the most raw and personal writing that I've ever written, and that is my unreliable narrator chapter in the Mad Women section. And I say that in quotes because, often that label was ascribed to women who were in fact quite sane. And so the unreliable narrator chapter deals with Manhattan's potentially most haunted house in a very, very negative way, 14 West 10th Street, which is a residential building, not one to go see. It's not a tourist attraction. It is one that we talk about on our ghost tours, but we're always very respectful outside of that property. But it is very, very negative property, and lots of terrible things have happened there. So writing about that place that I have a visceral reaction to, like, makes that chapter live in a different place than, say, the exploration of the Winchester Mystery House, which was a night and day contrast.
If you don't mind my asking, do you mind going into a little bit of detail about the history of that residence?
Jan Bryant Bartell wrote a memoir called Spindrift, and I will show it. So this is Spindrift's Spray from a Psychic Sea. And look at this kind of haunted face. Like she's ready-made for a ghost story. She chronicled her time in 16 West 10th Street and 14 West 10th Street with Share a Wall. She chronicled in her time there, many years there, the number of ill and dying and people who took their own life. And it is a startling number. And it starts to feel like there is something deeply wrong with the house. And there's a bunch of instances of seances. And this particular residence shows up in a great deal of historic New York accounts that were both published in the New York Times from like the 1930s through the 1950s. Like this has had a storied recurrence in ghost lore in the city. And Jan is adding to this with her memoir. She writes this memoir because she didn't like how one of the guys who ran the seance, Hans Holzer, had written this book about her account and then didn't even share some of her most palpable ghostly experiences during that seance. So she kind of wanted to have the last word about that. And then she died just after she finished the book. She managed to escape this very, very negative house and then died. And this book was published posthumously. And you kind of are reading this knowing on the jacket cover that she doesn't really make it in the end, even though she's like thinking that this house is going to kind of come for her. And it sort of does in the end. It's like this long, slow pan of terror. And that's before all of this is published in the 1970s. And then in 1980, Joel Steinberg moves in and there's a murder that he commits in that building. And that became a national news spectacle. It was a trial. He had beaten his partner, Hedda. And that murder, folks said that he changed when he moved into that house. And it was like a real life shining that played out on national television in 1980. And so in some ways, Jan is sort of like this canary in the coal mine of this very, very negative house. And we have to be very respectful about how we talk about this because it was a legitimate murder that happened, and a murder of a little girl too. It's a very, very fraught place. And it's definitely one we don't take lightly. Definitely one that we've noticed our customers on our ghost tours and our attendees, our audiences, do also have a very visceral reaction to that house. So again, we are always trying to keep a respectful distance because again, this is a residential building, but it's never been fully occupied. And there's been a lot of turnover there through the years, and you can kind of understand why.
That house has also a Mark Twain connection. In 1900, Mark Twain lived there for a bit. And it's really funny because I was just reading something the other day. It may have been in the notes to Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, which I pre-read for my kid because the illustrations are so terrifying that I don't want her to read every story. So I think I might have been like looking through the notes in the bibliography in the back, and I think he was quoting Mark Twain. Alvin Schwartz, I believe the author of the Scary Stories books, was quoting Mark Twain. Twain said, when you're telling a story in public with a jump scare, your ideal audience member should be, you know, a pretty young lady. She'll jump out of her seat if you tell it right, and she'll probably give a pretty little scream. And I was like, oh, Samuel Clemens, you got our number. But it was just really funny, that particular comment about choosing your audience. Find a sucker, find a girl, she'll scream. So my favorite stories are going to change on any given day. I find myself like weaving in and out of my favorites. Lately, I think one of my favorites has been The Red Lady of Huntington College from Alabama. This is a story that I found in a collection of true ghost stories by Catherine Tucker Wyndham. And apparently there were two ghosts in Huntington College back in the 1890s. There was a first red lady who appeared, and she walked up and down the quad, and she was all robed in red, and she was quite terrifying, and she frightened all the female students. But she was just kind of like this mysterious specter. And then a few years later, a girl moved to the college. She started living in the college dorm. Martha, her name is Martha. Anyway, so she's this like rich, Gilded Age New Yorker, and she's very distant. She's very aloof. She kind of holds herself apart from her classmates, and she becomes very, very lonely and very depressed and then suicidal. And the night that she slits her wrist, the window over her door starts to shine with this red light, and the whole room is bathed in this bright red light. And she's found awash in a sea of blood in a crimson dress, echoing the first ghost's crimson dress of a few years ago. And so there's like this room awash with blood, the repeated motif of the color red, the two ladies who mirror each other. It's very Poe-esque, very dramatic. It does not seem, as far as my research could tell, at all grounded in reality. Catherine Tucker Wyndham was an alumna of Huntington College, and she may have been just repeating some sort of kind of folklore. I find a lot of campus folklore doesn't have even the remotest grain of truth in it, but these stories are kind of like cautionary tales and legends. That one specifically has to do, I think, with like the need to fit in when you go to college. But a lot of these, you know, dark academia ghosts, they reflect, you know, very real anxieties that women have during the college experience, very real dangers. And just like kind of on a larger, you know, social level, I think that the prevalence of these stories, particularly from like the mid-century to the 1970s, these stories reflect kind of that fear or censure of a woman who is beginning to leave the domestic sphere and begin to educate herself and move through the academic and commercial. Ultimately, you know, she'll get a job, possibly, these kinds of like masculine spheres. So for a woman to finally leave the domestic world is something that has to be, in these morality tales, punished, right? So I don't know, lately I've been really into the poetic nature of that dark academia stuff. And then my other favorite ghosts, I really also have been into the Greenbrier ghost. Like I periodically reread my chapters and I'm looking at them. And so I'm looking at the Greenbrier ghost. That is in the West Virginia Wives chapter. And I'm like, oh yeah, I love that story. Young murdered wife whose mother believes that her husband killed her, but the official report is an accident. And she goes to the police chief and claims that her daughter's ghost appeared to her in a dream and told her to disinter her body and look again. And upon closer examination, it does seem as though she's been strangled and pushed down the stairs. So this is a mother using the story of a ghost to get justice for her daughter. And I'm like, oh, I love that. On the other side of things, in the chapter about ghostly mothers, there's a mother who had two ungrateful daughters who refused to bring the cows in at twilight when she told them to. So the mother went out herself to get the cow and slipped and fell in a bit of swampy, kind of muddy water. And I think she like broke her leg. She was there all night. The snow started to fall. She froze to death. Her body was found the next morning. And her ghost began to haunt her lazy, ungrateful daughters. And she became this kind of like tricksy poltergeist, vengefully and mean-spiritedly attacking her daughters and scratching them. And in my favorite little episode, she braids their hair together while they sleep. So they wake up with one long rope knotted together. And I just love, there's a lot of beautiful imagery, like her in this marsh at twilight and the snow coming down and like the hair braided together. There's a fairy tale quality to it. So These are my favorite stories right now. Ask me in a week, I'll have a different answer.
We're speaking with Leanna Renee Hieber and Andrea Janes, authors of A Haunted History of Invisible Women, True Stories of America's Ghosts. As you note in your book, and you mentioned earlier, women authors were and are a big source of ghost stories. And we also make up a large portion of the audience that's consuming things like ghost stories, ghost hunting shows, psychic readings, astrology, etc. You both have been active in the larger paranormal community/industry for some time. What has your experience been as a woman?
I've not faced the kind of pushback that I've heard women have faced in paranormal investigation spheres or on the paranormal television shows where it's very, very male-centric. Katrina Weidman, a fantastic woman who has been on Paranormal Lockdown, Paranormal State, a bunch of different paranormal shows. I got to talk to her and put her words into our introduction, talking about it's been hard to carve out a space there. As tour guides, because we're really focusing on the history and then letting the ghost stories be additional ways in which we can make that past contemporaneous with our present moment. I've had a lot of people take what I'm saying and just be engaged with the material. So I really, in this particular field, I haven't felt direct sexism. When I was working on double-decker buses, in my first job as a tour guide, people didn't want to listen to, predominantly men, didn't want to listen to my safety instructions. And a guy almost got his head cut off by a street lamp. Little me had to push this big, tall, burly guy down in his seat as I'm like ducking and pointing at this street lamp when I had said like 5 minutes prior. And just everyone was, in that regard, it was like, wow, I didn't want to be a school marm in this job. As a ghost tour guide with a walking tour public, walking tour participants are a much more engaged group in general. And so I find that I can just have much more of a conversation with people. And if people are like, maybe skeptics, that's fine. We welcome them. We don't demand anybody believe anything. So I think because we're not coming at anything with an antagonism in this, we're just like, hey, here's some weird stuff. Here's some history though. I found it to be relatively conflict free, but that's not necessarily the case across every aspect of the paranormal.
I will say that when I started the company, I was very careful with my marketing because I wanted to be clear that this was not going to be the kind of ghost tour that you show up drunk to and wear costumes to, that this was going to be a kind of more thoughtful and respectful experience where we really kind of try to honor these lives. And I'm always very careful in the language that I use and the message that I send. And I do think Leanna's right. With our ghost tours, we tend to get fewer confrontational history buffs. Like there's a joke about like the Civil War dad. There's always a Civil War dad on your straight history tour and he wants to challenge you. We don't get as much of that. The one funny byproduct of this, our customers are delightful. The one funny byproduct of this, as the owner of the company, I can tell you, I have a great deal of difficulty hiring and retaining male employees. And I always joke about how I can't find a good man because I have had so much trouble. I have been ghosted by male hires, literally hired people, have them sign the paperwork and they don't show up for their shift and I never hear from them again. I remember once I had a group interview and I did a scavenger hunt activity during the group interview. Because I had like 20 people apply for one job. So I did this group interview and one professional licensed male tour guide was affronted at the concept of the scavenger hunt. And he said, I didn't come here to be insulted and play games. And he stormed off in a huff. This is the kind of experience I've had with a few exceptions. Some of my collaborators and partners have been wonderful. I collaborate frequently with a gentleman who does a Titanic tour and he's like the nicest, most respectful human being ever. So I love him. But honestly, for the most part, we've only had female or gender non-binary hires. We have not had any male hires.
I don't envy you, Andrea, in the having to be the boss lady scenario, because I do think that almost creates a different dynamic for how people react.
Oh yeah, it's really funny. And one thing I have noticed, this is my message for working women everywhere. Women are not demanding what they are worth, and they consistently will accept lower salaries than they deserve. And I'm consistently like, whenever I have enough money, consistently trying to pay my guides more money because I'm like, guys, you work hard and I know what it takes. The amount of energy it takes to lead a tour through New York City and hold that space against all of your competition, from sirens to drunk people yelling at you. it takes a tremendous amount of energy, and I really respect all the work that our guides do. And I'm always trying to give them as much as they deserve. And I heard somebody the other day, an acquaintance of mine, and this is a paraphrase. She said, "Oh, I'm glad so-and-so doesn't know what they're worth on the open market, or we'd have to pay her a lot more." And I was like, So people out there, if you are working and you are female identifying, double check what your market value is and demand it. Do not settle for less. I'm always shocked at how hard women will work for how little money. So yeah, no more invisible labor, you guys.
Yeah, every industry has this discussion. And thank you for, creating a space for us, Jessie, to have this conversation.
My last question for you is kind of along the lines of, why do we love ghost stories? Obviously, things like true crime and kind of morbid documentaries have seen a rise in popularity in recent years. How do you feel about that? And do you see a similar rise happening for ghost stories?
It's so hard to answer this question with any sense of perspective when you've been a lifelong weirdo. But, people have been saying ghosts are becoming increasingly popular for years and years and years, and I can't see them getting any more popular. And then they do, along with witches. And there is a wonderful writer named Taya Miles who wrote Tales from the Haunted South, and I believe that she refers to that as ghost fancy. We live in a culture of ghost fanciers. I mean, it's been like the last 20 years, and it shows no signs of abating. There's these very broad general theories as the world devolves further into chaos, and further and further and further, we become deeply interested in the occult. But isn't that perennially true of humanity always? I just don't think the ghosts will ever go anywhere. Until people stop dying, there will be interesting ghosts. So until someone invents a cure for death, my friend, the spirits will be with us.
I think the paranormal reflects the anxieties of any time that you are living in, and we live in a very complicated time. We would love to do book 2, so we have more stories to tell. I mean, this is by no means is A Haunted History of Invisible Women a compendium, nor is it an encyclopedia. It is carefully curated stories that really spoke to Andrea and I respectively and jointly. And so there's so much more to tell. So we hope the book does well enough that we can continue this as a bit of a series. So it's available wherever books are sold. And I appreciate everyone's time and interest. And I hope everyone has a great fall season.
Leanna Renee Hieber and Andrea Janes are history and ghost tour operators with Jane's company Burrows of the Dead in New York City, and they're the authors of A Haunted History of Invisible Women, True Stories of America's Ghosts. It's out now on Citadel Press. Hieber is also the award-winning author of several Gothic and supernatural novels. You can learn more about her at leannareneehieber.com and their tours at burrowsofthedead.com.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us for this week's 51%. 51% is a national production of WAMC Northeast Public Radio in Albany, New York. It's produced and hosted by me, Jessie King. Our associate producer is Jody Cowan. Our executive producer is Dr. Alan Chartock. And our theme is Lolita by the Albany-based artist Girl Blue. Thanks again to our guests, Leanna Renee Hieber and Andrea Janes, for sharing their time with us. For some of our other interviews or to find episodes new and old, check us out at our website. That's WAMCpodcast.org. If it's not too late to say it, enjoy the rest of your spooky season and have a happy Halloween. I'm Jessie King for 51%.
I was every single girl, I was nobody else, I was so sure of myself. I was 15 and a half, he was a hollow laugh. And I lost my cool somewhere along the way. At night and down the hallway, I had to learn how to look away. I lost my cool